Welcome to the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Giants. I'm Paul Dottino, and it's my pleasure to be joined by a writer who has been around the NFL for an awful long time. I think I'm going to date both he and I because we are old-timers. The author of Once a Giant, Gary Myers. It is the story of the 1986 Super Bowl 21 championship New York Giants. And Gary, I think the important thing for people to remember, it's not just about football. This is about the personalities, the stories behind the guys who made the Giants champions. And you also weave in background and to put everything into context. And I think that's what will make a lot of young folks want to read this book because they need to understand more about what those Parcells Giants were about.
Absolutely. I had two goals in writing this book. One is it couldn't be like a game-by-game account of what happened in '86 because that was done in tons of books that were written after that Super Bowl. But I wanted to give people a feel for the brotherhood that was formed in 1986, and a very unusual brotherhood. And like you mentioned, how 37 years later, I mean, these guys are still tight as can be, and they help each other out. But the main focus of the book and my inspiration for doing it was I really wanted to tell the story of life after football. And I think it's such a crucial topic. It's been moved to the forefront somewhat in the last 10 years with all the talk about CTE and concussion lawsuits and stuff. But the issues go much deeper than that. So what I did was I got into who these players were and maybe talked about a player or two that was so instrumental in helping the Giants win that first championship. And then I would tell what's going on in their lives now. Mm-hmm. And those who were, in position to help those who needed the help. So it's filled with heartbreaking stories, but also some real heartwarming stories.
The patriarch of that team, and it will always be Bill Parcells. Let's not kid ourselves. This is the guy, the tuna, who made it all happen, who you and I both know, because we covered that team together, was not always liked by the players in the locker room. But as time has gone on, I think their affection for what it is that he tried to do and accomplish with them has grown so much over time. And obviously, in reading some of the chapters of your book, including the one where you talk about how he has helped so many unfortunate players, it is really the legacy of what Parcells meant to those guys.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, as well as anybody, that was a love-hate relationship that those players had with Bill. They loved the winning. They hated the process because he really worked them hard. Those were the days in training camp where you can put them in pads twice a day. And by the end of the second practice, these guys were beat. And during the season, you're allowed to practice in pads. I mean, you still are, but, coaches would do it maybe once a week, where Parcells would do it, at least twice a week. And so, getting to that championship, a lot of their motivation was like to stick it to Parcells because he drove them so hard.
Yeah.
But Phil Simms has a great line in the book about how the players, and he always had a very interesting relationship with Bill, but how the players have come to appreciate Bill because of what he meant to them, not only in their football lives, but in their off the field life, and how he taught them so many life lessons along the way that they still quote him on today. And like you mentioned, financially, he's helped out about 20 players who have come to him, and he realizes when they do, it's a matter of last resort because they have to be embarrassed going to their former coach and asking for money. But he set aside some money of all the money that he's made that he has earmarked just to help his former players. And, when I asked him why he did that, why he does that, and he said they just sacrificed so much for him that helped him win 2 Super Bowls and become a Hall of Fame coach, that he feels it's a responsibility and an obligation because he's in a position to help, that he wants to help.
Gary, all the years that you spent compiling this, and obviously you had a head start because you covered the team, but then all of the interviews you did, the travel you did, sitting down with people, including Lawrence Taylor at a golf tournament, which I know how that's a great story in the book near the back end. Yeah. Could you tell me in your words, what do you think a Parcells guy is? Define that guy for me.
That's what's funny about that question is that we knew who the Parcells guys were, and we kind of figured out why, but we never asked Bill, like, what's the definition of a Parcells guy? And, considering that group was, Phil and Harry and Carl Banks and Lawrence, and George Martin, obviously, you look at the common traits that those guys have, ultra competitive, good locker room guys, other than Lawrence, obviously, took care of themselves off the field. Lawrence was a good locker room guy. Players loved him. Off the field, they had no idea, what he did at the end of the day. And in those days, it wasn't as well known as it would be today. But I would say it was guys that he could count on in the locker room. I mean, the famous line was, he always used to, if something was bothering Bill, he would go to Harry or George and just say, fix it. And they would know what he wanted fixed, and they would carry it out for him. And there were Parcells guys at each of his other stops. And Curtis Martin was a Parcells guy. I'm trying to think, who else, who in New England was, there was a fullback there that he really liked, whose name right now, Blitzer was originally, because he drafted him. In Dallas, he had his guys. Tony Romo was obviously, one of his guys. But, clearly the Parcells guys were the ones with the Giants.
Yeah. I think one of the important things, and you mentioned this in the book, Gary, that the only member of that 86 team who had a Super Bowl ring was Kenny Hill, the former Raider, who eventually, and I have a feeling because of Al Davis's connection to Parcells, that's one of the reasons Parcells wound up getting him on the Giants. But I think it's important to understand that none of those guys were champions until they were champions together.
Right.
And I think that's an added part of why their bond is like crazy glue.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. They learned, like I mentioned in the book, they learned how to win together. And they learned a lot of that from Parcells, because he knew what it took to win, although he had never been a champion, himself. So they were experiencing this for the first time together. And, also, Paul, also the fact that it was the Giants' first championship in 30 years, that made it even more special. I mean, you've been around all the Giants Super Bowl teams, and I would say that the 86 team, because it was the first and because it had all these iconic names on there, on the team, that is a team that is embraced and romanticized the most out of the 4 championship teams. I think clearly the best game out of the 4 Super Bowls, I mean, 2 out of the 4 were really good. The Norwood game, that was a tremendous game. But the fact that the 07 team beat an undefeated team in the Super Bowl and was coached by Belichick, that was probably the greatest victory, single game victory in the Giants' history. But there's no question in my mind that the 86 team was the most popular. The 07 team was just kind of an ordinary team that got really hot in the playoffs, which obviously is the best time to get hot. But the 86 team was great from beginning to end, despite losing that opening game on the Herschel Walker run in Dallas. They only lost one more game the rest of the year.
You love turf. You're good at it. So you start a turf biz. Business grows, your savings grow. Become the most celebrated name in turf. Are you ready for all that life brings?
You mentioned Bill Belichick a couple of minutes ago, and I want to go back to that because there's a part in the book where you talk about tracking him down. And Belichick was never the most vocal guy. We all know that. But you track him down, and he sends you back literally pages and pages and pages of emails to contribute to this book. And I don't think anybody who knows Belichick would be surprised that he would participate, because we saw when he was brought to the old Giants Stadium how emotional he got.
Yeah.
He's got that blue blood in his veins, and I was so happy to hear that he did participate in your project.
Yeah, the backstory to that is for a really long time, more than a decade, Bill and I didn't speak because I was very critical of him for the Spygate nonsense.
Right.
I mean, that was legitimate cheating, what he was doing. It wasn't, to me, whether it won him any games or not, I don't know, but it was certainly against the rules. but I was very critical of him. And then in 2020, and just during that period of time from say 07 to 2020, I would go to the press conferences up in New England, and he would answer my questions, really quickly. And if I ever tried to talk to him coming off the podium, he kind of brushed me off because I knew he was mad at me, and that's okay. I never had a problem with coaches or players being mad at me. It's just part of the job. But in 2020, I'm part of the Hall of Fame committee, and they formed a separate committee for that year to pick the centennial class. So we're in Canton, and this is 2 or 3 days after the Patriots were eliminated by the Titans in what turned out to be Brady's last game for the Patriots. And Bill and I wound up sitting next to each other. And I was thinking to myself, this is going to be a really long 8 hours if we don't talk at all. And so I just kind of figured I'm going to break the ice. And if he wants to ignore me, so be it. At least I gave it a shot. And Paul, we had the best time. And it made me really regret that I hadn't talked to him for such a long time, because, he was asking me questions about the Hall of Fame process, knowing I had been on the committee for a long time. We were putting in a lot of senior players who, none of us saw play, but Bill studied the tape. So I'd ask him about that. And we just really had a nice time. And since then, we've exchanged a lot of emails. I wish him luck every season, and he writes me back, with some thoughts on Hall of Famers coming up. So anyhow, I know that's a really long answer, but I emailed him to ask him if he would help me with this book, because I really wanted his insight. And I said, I'll come up to Foxborough. This is during training camp.